3 small ships sailed into an unknown ocean, towards a destination that existed only in the imagination of one determined man. Their commander believed he could reach the riches of Asia simply by sailing west. It was an idea that many believed was impossible, not because the earth was flat, but because the journey seemed far too long to survive. Christopher Columbus believed everyone else had made the same mistake. He believed the world was smaller than it truly was. He was certain that if he sailed far enough, he would arrive in Japan, then China, and finally the magnificent trading cities of Asia. Instead, he unknowingly sailed toward a continent that Europeans did not yet realize existed. The voyage that followed would become one of the most famous expeditions in human history. It opened the door to exploration, to empires, to trade, but also to war, conquest, and unimaginable human suffering. For centuries, many celebrated Columbus as a fearless explorer. Today, his name divides historians, politicians, and the public alike. So, was Christopher Columbus a hero who forever expanded humanity's understanding of the world? Or was he a villain whose voyages marked the beginning of centuries of suffering? To answer that question, we must first understand the world that existed before Columbus ever set sail. By the late 15th century, Europe was changing faster than ever before. Kingdoms were growing richer, cities were expanding, and powerful rulers competed for wealth, power, and prestige. Across Europe, luxury goods from the East became symbols of wealth: silk, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg. These products were worth enormous fortunes. Today, these spices seem ordinary, but in medieval Europe, they could be worth almost their weight in gold. These valuable goods traveled thousands of miles, passing through countless kingdoms, merchants, and trading cities before finally arriving in Europe. Every stop along the journey added another cost. Every middleman demanded a profit. By the time the cargo reached Europe, its value had multiplied many times over. Europe's rulers realized something important. If they could reach Asia directly, they could become unimaginably rich. Whoever controlled a direct route to Asia would control one of the greatest trading opportunities in history. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 strengthened Ottoman control over one of the most important gateways between Europe and Asia. Although trade continued, European powers became increasingly interested in finding routes that relied less on existing intermediaries. One kingdom had already taken the lead: Portugal. Rather than crossing the Atlantic, Portuguese captains sailed farther and farther down the coast of Africa, hoping eventually to reach the Indian Ocean. Their method was careful, slow, methodical. Each expedition added another piece to the map. Most experienced navigators believed this was the safest way to reach Asia, but one man believed everyone else was looking in the wrong direction. While Portugal looked south, Christopher Columbus was preparing to gamble everything by sailing west. Christopher Columbus was born around 1451 in the thriving maritime city of Genoa, a powerful republic on the northwest coast of present-day Italy. Unlike many famous explorers, Columbus was not born into wealth or nobility. His father worked as a wool weaver. His family lived comfortably, but far from the royal courts that would later shape his destiny. From an early age, the sea captured his imagination. Every ship entering Genoa carried stories of distant kingdoms, strange peoples, and unimaginable riches. As a young man, Columbus chose a life at sea. He served aboard merchant vessels, learning navigation through practical experience rather than formal education. Over the years, he sailed throughout the Mediterranean and later ventured into the Atlantic, gaining experience few Europeans possessed. Whenever he was ashore, Columbus immersed himself in books. He studied geography, astronomy, navigation, and the writings of ancient scholars. Much of his knowledge came from respected authorities, including the ancient Greek geographer Ptolemy, along with later medieval writers whose works circulated throughout Europe. Like nearly every educated European of his age, Columbus accepted that the Earth was spherical. Contrary to one of history's most enduring myths, he was not trying to prove the Earth was round. His great mistake was something entirely different. He underestimated the Earth's circumference and overestimated how far Asia stretched eastward. Together, those errors made the Atlantic appear far smaller than it truly was. According to his calculations, Japan, China, and the wealthy cities of Asia lay only a few weeks beyond the western horizon. It was a bold conclusion, one that would define the rest of his life. To many, his calculations seemed dangerously optimistic, but Columbus believed he had discovered a truth that every other navigator had failed to see. Now, all he needed was someone willing to believe him. Columbus needed money. Ships, crews, and supplies required something he did not possess: the support of a king. So, during the 1480s, he presented his proposal to King João II of Portugal. Portugal was already Europe's leading maritime power. Its experts understood geography and navigation extremely well, and when they examined Columbus's calculations, they were not convinced. The proposal was rejected. Columbus had seriously underestimated the distance westward to Asia, and Portugal already had enormous resources invested in its route around Africa. But Columbus refused to abandon his idea. He turned instead to neighboring Castile, part of the emerging Spanish monarchy ruled by Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. But once again, success did not come quickly. Columbus spent years attempting to win their support. His proposal was examined by royal advisors, and once again, experts questioned his calculations. Yet the monarchs did not completely dismiss him. They kept him close, while Spain dealt with a far greater priority. For years, Ferdinand and Isabella had been fighting the Kingdom of Granada, the last Muslim-ruled state on the Iberian Peninsula. Then, in January 1492, Granada surrendered. The victory transformed the political situation. The crown could now devote greater attention to opportunities elsewhere. And Columbus, still waiting after years of rejection, made his case one more time. Negotiations nearly collapsed. Columbus demanded extraordinary rewards if he succeeded, including noble status, a share of future profits, and powerful titles over lands he might encounter. For a man without noble birth, his ambitions were remarkable. Finally, on the 17th of April, 1492, the agreement known as the Capitulations of Santa Fe was issued. After years of rejection, Columbus had what he needed: royal support. Now the idea that had consumed him for years was becoming real. Ships had to be secured, supplies gathered, and perhaps most importantly, men had to be convinced to sail with him. 3 vessels would carry the expedition into the Atlantic: the Niña, the Pinta, and Columbus's flagship, the Santa Maria. Their destination was supposedly Asia, but between Spain and the world, Columbus imagined, lay an ocean far larger than he understood. And on the morning of August 3rd, 1492, they would sail straight into it. On the morning of August 3rd, 1492, Columbus finally sailed. Around 90 men left southern Spain aboard 3 vessels, the Niña, the Pinta, and the flagship Santa Maria. They believed they were sailing for Asia. None of them knew what actually waited beyond the horizon, but they did not immediately strike out across the open ocean. First, the fleet sailed southwest toward the Canary Islands. There, repairs were made and final preparations completed. The Pinta's rudder had caused trouble almost immediately, forcing repairs while the expedition remained near the Canaries. Then, on September 6th, the real voyage began. The 3 ships turned west. Behind them, the last familiar islands disappeared. Ahead, there was nothing but ocean. Day after day, the fleet continued west. No coastline, no harbor, no certainty that Columbus was right. Columbus navigated using experience, compass headings, estimates of speed and direction, and dead reckoning. Each day he calculated how far the fleet had traveled. But there was a problem. He did not always tell his crew the same distance that he recorded for himself. According to the surviving account, Columbus sometimes reported a shorter distance to the men, apparently hoping to prevent them from becoming alarmed by just how far they had sailed from home. As the weeks passed, anxiety grew. These men were experienced sailors, but few had ever traveled so far into the open Atlantic, with no land in sight, and Columbus kept telling them, "Continue west." Then strange signs began appearing. Great patches of floating seaweed surrounded the ships. Birds appeared overhead. Branches and vegetation drifted past. To Columbus, these were signs that land must be close. Again and again, it wasn't. Later stories transformed this anxiety into a dramatic mutiny, with terrified sailors supposedly threatening to throw Columbus into the sea. The surviving evidence is far less dramatic. There was genuine fear, there was complaining, and pressure to turn back became increasingly serious. But the famous full-scale mutiny is largely a legend. Columbus refused to abandon the expedition. He was convinced that Asia lay somewhere ahead, and by October 10th, tension aboard the fleet had reached a dangerous level. But then, the ocean began offering clues. The crews saw birds moving across the sky. They recovered vegetation from the water and pieces of wood that appeared to have been shaped by human hands. This time, land really was close. On the night of October 11th, nobody wanted to sleep. Columbus later reported seeing a mysterious light in the darkness, appearing, disappearing, then appearing again. What he actually saw remains uncertain. Then, around 2 a.m, a lookout aboard the Pinta saw something, a dark shape, breaking the horizon. After more than a month crossing the open Atlantic, there could finally be no mistake. Land. As dawn broke on October 12th, 1492, the sailors saw a green island rising from the Atlantic. After more than a month beyond the Canary Islands, they had reached land. Columbus believed he had arrived among islands lying somewhere off the coast of Asia. He had no idea that his calculations had failed. Exactly which island Columbus first reached remains uncertain, He recorded its indigenous name as Guanahani and renamed it San Salvador. Historians have proposed several possible islands in the modern Bahamas, but its precise identity remains debated. Columbus went ashore with armed members of his expedition, carrying the royal banner. He formally claimed the island for Ferdinand and Isabella. From the Spanish perspective, this was an act of discovery and possession. But there was an obvious problem. The island was already inhabited. The people Columbus encountered were Lucayan Taino, part of the wider Taino cultural world of the Caribbean. They had communities, families, trade networks, agriculture, and their own political and spiritual traditions. To them, the strange vessels appearing offshore were every bit as unfamiliar as the Caribbean was to the Europeans. At first, the encounter was largely peaceful. The two groups exchanged gifts. Columbus described the islanders as friendly and generous, noting that they readily shared what they possessed. For a brief moment, this could appear to be a story simply about two worlds meeting, but Columbus's journal reveals something far more troubling. Almost immediately, Columbus began evaluating the people he encountered in terms of what they could provide Spain. He noted their lack of European weapons, their apparent vulnerability, and their potential usefulness as servants. In the surviving account of his journal, he wrote that with a relatively small number of men, the islanders could be subjugated and made to do whatever the Spaniards wished. This was not something invented centuries later by Columbus's critics. The disturbing idea appears in the surviving record of the first day. Then Columbus noticed something else. Some islanders possessed small pieces of gold. That single observation immediately became important. He began questioning them, trying to determine where the metal had come from. The search for Asia was already becoming a search for wealth. The first meeting had involved no great battle. No army invaded the island. No city was destroyed. But within hours of arriving, Columbus was already thinking about gold, labor, and control. The darker consequences of the voyage had begun to take shape, and Columbus did not stop at Guanahani. Still convinced that the great kingdoms of Asia must be nearby, he sailed onward through the islands, searching for powerful rulers, great cities, and above all, gold. Later that month, the expedition reached Cuba. Columbus was astonished by its size and beauty, yet he still refused to abandon his geographical assumptions. Somewhere nearby, he believed, must lie the wealthy Asian courts described by European travelers. Columbus believed his great gamble had succeeded. He believed he had reached the outer regions of Asia and opened a route that would make Spain rich. But he had actually begun something far greater and far more destructive than he could possibly understand. Because the next island the expedition explored would become the center of Columbus's new colonial world, Hispaniola. And there, the story would become much darker. In early December 1492, Columbus reached an enormous island he called La Española, today divided between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. We know it as Hispaniola. To Columbus, it appeared almost impossibly beautiful. But more importantly, he believed it might contain the gold he desperately wanted to find. Hispaniola was already home to a large indigenous population, organized into communities under leaders known to the Spanish as caciques. The Taino cultivated crops, traded between communities, fished the surrounding waters, and possessed complex social and political traditions of their own. The Spaniards had entered their world. Columbus developed friendly relations with Guacanagari, one of Hispaniola's Taíno caciques, food and gifts were exchanged. The Spaniards received assistance, and for the moment, relations remained largely peaceful. Then, on Christmas Eve, disaster struck. During the night of December 24th, the flagship Santa María ran aground. The sea was not raging. There was no great storm, but the ship became trapped and could not be saved. Columbus had lost his flagship. According to the surviving account, Guacanagari and his people helped rescue the crew and recover supplies from the wreck. Columbus interpreted the disaster as an opportunity. The expedition now had more men than the remaining ships could comfortably carry home, so he made a momentous decision. Timber salvaged from the Santa María was used to establish a small outpost. Columbus called it La Navidad. It became the first Spanish settlement created during his voyages in the Americas. Columbus left 39 men behind. They were instructed to maintain relations with the local population and search for gold. Columbus promised he would return. Then he turned toward Spain. The return voyage was dangerous. Atlantic storms battered the ships, and for a time, Columbus feared his discoveries might die with him. But in March 1493, he finally returned to Iberia, and the obscure Genoese sailor, who had spent years begging kings for support, returned as a celebrity. He brought reports of extraordinary islands, unfamiliar plants, parrots, small quantities of gold, and indigenous people whom he had taken across the Atlantic. To the Spanish court, the voyage appeared to prove that Columbus had achieved something extraordinary. Columbus appeared before Ferdinand and Isabella and described fertile lands, potential riches, and populations he believed could be converted to Christianity. His gamble seemed to have paid off. Spain wanted more, and this time the expedition would be very different. In September 1493, Columbus sailed west again. But this was no longer simply a voyage of exploration. The first expedition had carried 3 ships and around 90 men. The second carried 17 ships and well over 1,000 people. They brought animals, weapons, priests, farmers, and settlers. Columbus was no longer merely searching for a route to Asia. Spain was beginning to build an empire. When Columbus returned to the Caribbean in 1493, everything had changed. He no longer commanded 3 small ships carrying explorers. Behind him sailed a fleet of 17 vessels, carrying well over 1,000 settlers, soldiers, sailors, and clergy. This was no longer simply an expedition. It was the beginning of colonization. Columbus first returned to La Navidad, the settlement where he had left 39 men. But the outpost was gone. The buildings had been destroyed, and the Spaniards left behind were dead. Exactly what happened is difficult to reconstruct. Spanish accounts indicate that the men had quarreled among themselves, dispersed through the surrounding territory, and abused local communities while searching for gold and women. Conflict followed. By the time Columbus returned, his first colony had collapsed. Columbus established another settlement farther east. He named it La Isabela, after Queen Isabella. It was intended to become a permanent European colony. But conditions were terrible. Food spoiled, disease spread. Many settlers had expected easy riches. Instead, they encountered hunger, exhaustion, and disappointment. And there was another problem. Columbus had promised Spain wealth. Yet the enormous Asian cities he expected to find did not exist. Neither did the vast quantities of gold he had imagined. Columbus now faced increasing pressure to make the colony profitable. By 1495, Columbus's administration imposed a system of tribute on parts of Hispaniola. Taino people in gold-producing areas were expected to deliver quantities of gold. Elsewhere, cotton could be demanded. For communities with limited access to gold, the demands could be devastating. Resistance increased. Some communities fled, others fought back. Spanish forces responded with military campaigns, and the imbalance was enormous. The Spaniards possessed steel weapons, crossbows, horses, and war dogs, technologies that Caribbean communities had never encountered in warfare. In 1495, Columbus participated in campaigns against indigenous resistance on Hispaniola. Spanish forces defeated opposing groups, captured prisoners, and strengthened colonial control. And increasingly, Columbus looked toward another source of profit: human beings. Columbus had already taken indigenous captives during his first voyage. But on the second, the scale increased dramatically. In 1495, hundreds of Taino people were captured. Several hundred were selected for shipment across the Atlantic, to be sold in Spain. Many did not survive the journey. This is crucial when judging Columbus's legacy. The enslavement of indigenous people was not merely something that happened centuries later, after his discoveries. Columbus himself participated in it, supported it, and attempted to use enslaved captives as part of the colony's economy. The consequences were catastrophic. Warfare, forced labor, displacement, hunger, and social disruption began tearing communities apart. And soon, another killer would arrive that neither Columbus nor the Taino understood: disease. The fearless navigator who had crossed the Atlantic was now something very different: a governor. And governing exposed weaknesses that courage at sea could not overcome. Complaints were growing, settlers were rebelling, violence was escalating, and eventually, even the Spanish crown would begin asking whether Christopher Columbus had lost control of the world he had helped create. By the late 1490s, Columbus's colony on Hispaniola was descending into chaos. Many Spanish settlers had crossed the Atlantic expecting easy riches. Instead, they found hunger, disease, hard labor, and far less gold than they had imagined. Their frustration increasingly turned toward Columbus himself. Some colonists openly rebelled. They accused Columbus and his brothers of mismanagement, withholding payments and provisions, and governing the colony with excessive severity. The great navigator was discovering that commanding ships and governing people were very different things. Later testimony accused the Columbus brothers of imposing brutal punishments, even against Spanish settlers. Some allegations may have been exaggerated by Columbus's enemies. Others are difficult to verify. But reports reaching Spain painted a picture of a colony in serious trouble. Complaints eventually reached Ferdinand and Isabella. The crown had invested money, prestige, and political authority in Columbus's enterprise. But Hispaniola was supposed to become a functioning Spanish possession. Instead, reports described rebellion, violence, and disorder. So the monarch sent someone to investigate. In 1500, a royal commissioner named Francisco de Bobadilla arrived on Hispaniola. His authority was extensive. He was there to investigate the unrest, restore royal control, and examine Columbus's administration. What he encountered quickly convinced him to act. Bobadilla seized control of the colony. Then he arrested Christopher Columbus. The man who had crossed the Atlantic for Spain, who had returned to Europe as a hero, was stripped of his governing authority. And his humiliation was not over. Columbus was placed in chains and sent back across the Atlantic to Spain. According to later accounts, when the ship's captain offered to remove the restraints, Columbus refused. He wanted Ferdinand and Isabella to see how their admiral had been treated. Yet this was not the end. Once Columbus reached Spain, the monarchs ordered his release. They did not restore him as governor of Hispaniola, but neither did they completely abandon him. Columbus still believed he could prove that his original vision had been right. He had lost his colony. He had lost his governorship. He had returned from his own territories in chains. But Columbus was not finished. At more than 50 years old, he prepared to cross the Atlantic one last time. Despite everything that had happened, Columbus remained convinced that his great geographical idea was fundamentally correct. He still believed the lands across the Atlantic belonged to the outer reaches of Asia, and somewhere beyond them, he believed there must be a passage to the Indian Ocean. So, in May 1502, Columbus sailed west for the fourth and final time. This expedition was much smaller than his second, just 4 ships and roughly 140 men. Among them was Columbus's young son, Ferdinand. Their mission was straightforward: find the passage that Columbus believed would finally lead to Asia. After crossing the Atlantic, Columbus reached the Caribbean, but he was no longer governor. When he approached Hispaniola, the colonial authorities refused his request to enter the harbor at Santo Domingo. Columbus had returned to the world he helped create, but he no longer controlled it. Columbus warned that a powerful storm was approaching. His warning was largely disregarded. Soon afterward, a devastating hurricane struck the region. A Spanish fleet sailing from Hispaniola towards Spain suffered catastrophic losses. Columbus's own ships, though battered, survived. Columbus then sailed west, reaching the coast of Central America. He explored along what are now Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. Everywhere he searched for the same thing: a channel through the land, leading toward the ocean beyond. He came tantalizingly close to one of history's greatest geographical discoveries. Beyond the narrow lands of Panama lay another enormous ocean, the Pacific. But Columbus never saw it. The passage he desperately wanted did not exist. Then the expedition began to fall apart. Months in tropical waters had allowed shipworms to eat through the wooden hulls. The vessels leaked constantly. Storms battered them. Supplies dwindled. Eventually, 2 remaining ships could go no farther. In June 1503, Columbus and his surviving crew became stranded on Jamaica. There they remained for more than a year. At first, local Taíno communities supplied the stranded Spaniards with food, but as months passed, relations deteriorated. Then Columbus used his astronomical knowledge in one of the strangest episodes of his career. Using published astronomical tables, he knew that a lunar eclipse would occur on February 29th, 1504. With food supplies becoming difficult to obtain, Columbus exploited that knowledge. He warned local people that his god was angry and pointed to the darkening moon as proof. The eclipse arrived as predicted. According to the account written by Columbus's son Ferdinand, the strategy worked. Supplies resumed. It was ingenious, but also deeply manipulative. Another moment that captures the contradictions of Columbus himself. Eventually, help arrived. Columbus returned to Spain, In 1504, there would be no fifth voyage. His health was deteriorating, and the political world around him had changed. Later that same year, Queen Isabella died. One of Columbus's most important royal supporters was gone. Columbus spent his final years pursuing the titles, income, and privileges he believed were owed to him. On May 20th, 1506, Christopher Columbus died in Valladolid, Spain. He was around 54 years old. He died without understanding the true scale of what he had encountered. He had crossed the Atlantic 4 times, but he never reached Asia, and he never knew that history would eventually attach his name to an entirely different world. So, more than 500 years later, how should we remember Christopher Columbus as the fearless navigator who crossed an ocean and transformed humanity's understanding of the world? Or as the colonial governor whose ambitions brought exploitation, enslavement, and violence? Was he a hero or a villain? The answer depends partly on what exactly we are judging. There is no denying Columbus possessed extraordinary determination. He spent years pursuing an idea that kings, scholars, and experienced navigators repeatedly rejected. And when he finally received his opportunity, he led 3 small vessels across thousands of kilometers of open Atlantic. Whatever we think of the man, that required genuine courage and considerable seamanship. He also demonstrated impressive navigational instincts. He crossed the Atlantic repeatedly, survived hurricanes, recognized changing winds and currents, and returned from voyages that placed enormous physical demands upon him. Columbus was wrong about the size of the Earth, but he was not an incompetent sailor, and his voyages undeniably became a turning point in world history. Not because Europeans were the first humans to reach the Americas. They weren't. And not even because Columbus was the first European. He wasn't. But because after 1492, sustained contact between Europe and the Americas would never again disappear. But courage does not erase consequences. From the earliest days of contact, Columbus viewed indigenous people not simply as potential allies, but as subjects who could be controlled, converted, put to work, and eventually enslaved. These ideas were not invented by modern critics. They appear in the surviving records of his own voyages. Under Columbus's colonial administration, indigenous captives were shipped across the Atlantic. Tribute was imposed. Military campaigns were conducted against resistance, and colonial demands helped create a system of exploitation, whose consequences became increasingly devastating. Columbus did not personally commit every act of violence, but neither was he merely an innocent observer. He was an active participant in the system taking shape. Over the decades that followed, indigenous populations across the Caribbean suffered catastrophic decline. European diseases were a major cause, but they were not the only cause. Forced labor, warfare, displacement, hunger, and the destruction of existing communities all contributed to the catastrophe. One defense of Columbus is that he was simply a man of his time. And historical context does matter. The 15th century was violent. Slavery existed across multiple societies. Conquest and religious expansion were accepted instruments of power. We should be careful about pretending Columbus lived in the 21st century. But that argument has limits, because even in his own time, the treatment of indigenous peoples became a subject of controversy. In the decades that followed, figures such as Bartolomé de las Casas fiercely condemned Spanish abuses in the Americas, and Columbus himself had already been removed as governor after serious complaints about his administration. So judging his actions critically is not purely a modern invention. People living much closer to his world could also recognize cruelty and injustice. Christopher Columbus was neither the mythical hero of older schoolbooks, nor does history become clearer if we reduce him to a one-dimensional monster. He was a remarkably determined navigator who accomplished something extraordinarily difficult. He was also ambitious, deeply mistaken about the world he was exploring, and willing to exploit other human beings in pursuit of wealth, status, and empire. Both realities belong to the same man. Perhaps the more important question is not whether Columbus deserves a statue or a single label. It is whether we can recognize an extraordinary historical achievement without ignoring the people who paid the price for it. Because history rarely gives us perfect heroes or perfect villains. It gives us people whose choices have consequences far beyond anything they imagined. Columbus did not know he was beginning a new era, but his voyages helped connect two worlds, with consequences that would reshape everything: languages, empires, economies, cultures, populations, and ultimately, the modern world itself. So after everything you've seen, what do you think? Christopher Columbus, hero, villain, or something far more complicated?